last panel of the day. I think we've got the echo sorted now. So we'll close out the last panel for Chamber 2 and on the role of activism of civil society and social movements. And our first speaker will be Ramzy Baroud. Ramzy is a journalist, editor of the Palestine Chronicle, and author of 6 books, including Our Vision for Liberation, co-edited with Ilan Pape, and he is a non-resident senior research fellow at CIGA, and he will be speaking to us about Sumud and self-determination, the enduring legacy against erasure. Ramzy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, for the invitation, and for holding this conference at an extremely critical time for the Palestinian struggle and the Palestinian solidarity movement. Just a little note that there was a very strong echo coming from your side. I'm not sure if the other speakers could hear it as well. This could become relevant later on in the Q&A period. Just a quick note. I just want to kind of start by just trying to reflect here on all these markers that we consider, like whenever we think about the history of the Palestinian struggle, the history of the so-called conflict, the history of Zionism, colonialism, we kind of go through all of these markers, starting with, the first Zionist conference, the Balfour Declaration, the Mandate period, and of course the adjoining violence, extreme violence and campaigns of suppression that were not just reflecting themselves on just violence in the streets or in prisons, but within the kind of laws and regulations that were injected into the discourse in order for them to justify that kind of violence against Palestinians, starting with the emergency regulations of the British, and then the denial of livelihoods, the numerous conspiracies and papers, and the all the way culminating to the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. And then Israel, with the new emergency laws that were based, kind of like picked up where the British had left off, which is very important, that we do not separate between British colonialism and Zionist colonialism. Essentially, they are an extension of one another. And then you had that period of Shatat, the diaspora of the Palestinian people. And we are all familiar where the Palestinian people are in terms of where they are located in the world now in terms of the refugees encampments, not just in the West Bank and Gaza, but also in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Egypt and elsewhere. And so those of us who have been working with various refugee communities are kind of familiar with how the Palestinian refugee it's not really a phenomenon that of a single group of refugees becoming refugees as a result of a singular historical event, a war, for example, but rather it's almost embedded in us as if it's our fate, our destiny. It's a concept now more than just an experience. So you talk to those refugees who become refugees once, twice, 3 times. Some Nakba refugees became refugees again during the Naksa, the war of 1967. They ended up going to Jordan, from Jordan to Lebanon, from Lebanon to Syria, from Syria to somewhere in Europe, Turkey, back to Lebanon, and so forth and so on. And then, of course, you have this perpetual war that Israel has launched, because Israel is a settler colonial regime, and settler colonial regimes cannot exist without colonial expansion. It comes with the job. It's part of the definition. There is no point in time where a settler colonial regime will come and say, you know what, I quit. I will not be a settler colonial regime. The moment you do is the moment you start shrinking, and therefore Israel takes every possible opportunity just to expand. Some trouble in Syria, you find a little bit of a margin, some vacuum, go for it. Grab as much land as you can. The whole grabbing of land, it is something that's not actually my term. That's Ariel Sharon used that term in a famous speech with the settlers. He given to us. I think it was in Kiryat Arba, but I can't be sure, where he spoke about, run, grab the tops of the hills, just grab whatever land you can, push the Palestinians out as fast as you can. It's just the very nature of the settler colonial regime. And of course, with grabbing and stealing, and you have to do the ethnic cleansing component. That just part of, it's just a direct result of that kind of colonialism, whether colonialism that happens at a mass scale, like the Nakba or the Naksa, or this kind of incremental genocide as termed by Ilan Pape and others. And during this time, you have, let's be honest, lack of international solidarity. When I say lack of international solidarity, the lack of solidarity that happens at a state where you have critical mass that could lead to that coveted paradigm shift. It just never happened. We are building a strong solidarity movement now, and we have been doing so for years, but it hasn't really registered to the point that it becomes this nagging concern for countries all around the world, that this issue has to be resolved to what is fair and just for the Palestinian people and this Palestinian cause. And also, since we are being honest, let's also talk about the role of the Arabs in all of this. I mean, this whole idea that I reject completely, of where are the Arab rulers? I mean, you kind of hear that in the discourse, but notice how Palestinians are far less keen on enunciating this idea of where are the Arab rulers, meaning where are the liberators? Why aren't they coming to the rescue, as should have been the case per certain cultural, historical understanding and experiences? Well, that did not happen, but I think it's far more complex than that. The Arab rulers have actually linked their cause to that of Israel, and they began normalizing openly or secretly, and they are actually far more keen on ensuring that the Palestinians lose in Gaza today than they are on Palestinians winning. Because the Palestinians win, that will when the real paradigm shift is going to start happening. And of course, during all of this, more Israeli, even during times of so-called peace, the peace process, Oslo 1, Oslo 2, the Paris Protocol, and so forth and so on, you continue to have the same behavior from Israel. More massacres, more violence, more illegal settlements, more destruction of ancient olive groves, more home demolitions, and the rest. And during that time, more siege within siege within siege. I also resent the term of the Gaza siege. What Gaza siege? Gaza has been under a perpetual state of siege since the Israeli occupation of 1967. Maybe that siege has eased a little bit. Maybe certain products were allowed in. Maybe a larger number of Palestinians are allowed to leave and come back. But essentially, it has always been a siege within a siege. And it has always been a state of war that just keeps getting more and more violent, all the way to the current genocide. Okay, so this has fundamentally changed the geography of Israel. Israel has grown exponentially. I mean, in 1967 alone, Israel has grown by almost three times or three folds as it was prior to 1967. So that box is being checked, but something has not changed. The Palestinian people, their determination, their resistance, their steadfastness. What is this all about? I mean, if you think about it from a rational point of view, we should not be talking about Palestine right now. It is a subject that should have been assigned the archives of history, considering what the Palestinian people have been through generation after generation, culminating to an actual state of extermination and genocide. But we are still talking about Palestine. Not just talking about Palestine, talking about Palestine in a present tense. Palestinian rights, Palestinian freedom, justice for the Palestinian people, free Palestine, everywhere, everywhere you go, everywhere you go. During the last 600 days or so, I have been to many countries. Unfortunately, I did not have the chance to be with you today, and I really wanted to, but circumstances beyond my control prevented me from doing so. But wherever you go, from Madrid to Rome, to so many capitals in the Western world, let alone the global South. Clearly, there is a global majority now that is siding with the Palestinian people. But how did the Palestinian people manage to insert this reality on the rest of the world? Well, definitely not because of the Arab League or the Arab rulers, or because of the Palestinian leadership, God forbid, Mahmoud Abbas and his ilk. None of this. It is because of this term that we just quite often use haphazardly, that is of Sumud, steadfastness. But Sumud is not a sentimental word. It's not an emotional term. Sumud is a culture that is rooted in defiance, in history, in faith, in spirituality, in family, in community. What you see in Gaza right now is the greatest possible manifestation of Sumud you will ever see. Children are the only, in some situation, you will have a single child surviving the annihilation of the entire clan or family. And he would stand in front of the camera to recite poetry about why he would not leave Gaza and why he would fight until the last drop of blood. Sumud is an actual functional term. And I will tell you why in a minute, why we neglect this kind of terminology, and or we infuse it sometimes as a footnote when we write about the history of Palestine and the history of the conflict or so-called conflict. The language of Sumud ranges from poetry, storytelling, but also Quranic verses, revolutionary terminologies. Whether you are an Islamist or a Marxist, everybody has a discourse of Sumud that all somehow circles back to the term. Words like Sumud itself, muqawama, hurriya, thawra, revolution, freedom, resistance. In Palestinian culture, we do not distinguish between muqawama and another muqawama, between one form of resistance or another form of resistance. These are terminologies that we have created conveniently to accommodate our ideological, political sensitivities and the sensibilities of our audiences in the West. But you don't go to Gaza and someone is going to say this form of resistance versus that form of resistance. Muqawama is a concept that is deeply embedded in the collective Palestinian heart. حتى آخر نقطة دم, until the last drop of blood. Unfortunately, it's actually now happening, actualizing that we are fighting until the last drop of blood. But even that is part of the Sumud discourse. Even the word Palestine itself, Palestine, Palestine. I grew up writing the word Palestine on the sand, on the beach of Gaza, like pretty much every Palestinian child in Gaza. It's the first thing. You write Palestine, you write your name, you write the name of your mother, you put a heart in there. That's what you do. It's a ritual. We all have to go through it. We write it on our books, on our hands, in every possible way. But why? We were not even aware of the fact that we are being part of this culture called Sumud, and that this culture will prove to be the greatest weapon in the face of colonialism. We did not know. That's the beauty of it. It's just you do it. We are shaped by that language. This generation in Gaza that is fighting until the last drop of blood is shaped by that language. It's a generational language. It goes all the way back to the very start of the liberation movement. It's not the Balfour Declaration. It's not the First Zionist Conference. It's not the Nation State Law of 2018. These are all very important components and markers of history, and they need to be highlighted time and again. But we are not haunted by them as ordinary people, as Palestinians in the streets of Gaza, Jabalia, fighting for the very survival of whomever remains in Jabalia, or Shuja'iyya, or Khan Yunis right now. There are alternative language, alternative characters. عز الدين القسام, عبد القادر الحسيني, أكرم زعيتر, غسان كنفاني, all the way to the fighting Palestinians in Gaza and their children, their journalists, their doctors, their ordinary people. This is not sentimental. I'm not talking poetry. I'm not talking emotions. I mean, yes, it is loaded with emotions, but I don't mean that to register an emotional moment. I have been speaking about people's history for many years, pushing this particular phrase, reclaiming the Palestinian narrative, and arguing long before any of this happened in Gaza that Gaza is the heart of Palestinian history and the heart of the Palestinian story and the heart of the Palestinian future. And I also kept saying, every time I made that claim, I kept saying this is not an emotional message, but a living reality. Because Gaza is where the worst possible manifestation of the Israeli occupation, Israeli apartheid, Israeli siege, Israeli war and violence and ethnic cleansing and today's genocide. It is the epicenter of the worst that this ugly Zionist ideology has to offer. But it's also the manifestation of a Palestinian resistance that has never ceased for a single moment. This, in my mind, is sufficient to make Gaza the most critical component of the entire history of this so-called conflict. The Israeli genocide in Gaza is not an act of collective punishment. I know, from a legal point of view, of course, you can make that argument, but I think it's far more complex than that. Because it seems to me that Israel, through a twisted logic and understanding of reality, has figured out the real fuel of the collective resistance in Palestinian society. Sumud is predicated on the people themselves, not on a single ideology, not on a group of individuals, not on a specific organization or faction and the like. It is the Palestinian people themselves. This is why you have that famous statement by a former Israeli justice minister, Eilat Shakid. In 2015, she said something that made headlines. She wrote a Facebook post in which she spoke about Palestinian children as the little snakes. And then she said that not only those little snakes have to be killed, but the mothers of those Palestinian martyrs and those little snakes would have to be killed as well. They should follow their sons, she wrote. Nothing could be more just, said the Justice Minister of Israel. I mean, that by itself is a whole different discussion on inhumanity and contradictions. But the point here is that why is this constant reference by the likes of it was Shimon Peres, I think, that who said something to the effect of, I wish to wake up one morning and realize that Gaza had sunk into the sea. I think it was Shimon Peres. I don't have the information in front of me. When Ariel Sharon made an argument in the early 50s, when he was the head of the Southern Command of the Israeli army, when he was killing people in Baroud in a refugee camp in central Gaza, and he made the argument that, and I don't want to repeat the word that he used to refer to Palestinian women, that they should also be killed because they are the ones who are giving birth to the terrorists. The Israelis have always had this understanding that the problem is the Palestinian people. It's not Hamas, it's not Yahya Sinwar, it's not Daif, and definitely not Mahmoud Abbas. That's a whole different subject. But they always had this understanding that it's the Palestinian mother, is the Palestinian father, is the Palestinian child, because they actually understood that the struggle for Palestine does not come from weapons. I mean, this whole concept about Hamas needs to give up its weapons. What weapons? What are we talking about? The weapons of Hamas and the Popular Front of the other socialists and Islamists are just things they make up, that make in their tunnels, the bombs that they dissect and recreate in the forms of landmines and such. It's not the kind of arsenal that you can account for. Well, you have this number of missiles, this number of bombs. This is the least of the concern of the resistance. The resistance is the fact that the people refuse to surrender their rights to Israel, refuse to be defeated by Zionism. This is the actual resistance in Palestinian society. In Israel's thinking, they feel like if to decimate the resistance, you have to kill the people in mass and ethnically cleanse the survivors, which is exactly what Israel is doing. It's exactly what Israel is doing. It's twisted and criminal, but it is kind of consistent with the understanding of this whole conflict from Israel's point of view, right? And I feel like we need to establish a new understanding regarding Palestine ourselves. So when I say centering, or when we say centering Palestinian voices, um, and by the way, when we say centering Palestinian voices, we should be referring to not just any person who could serve the role of the Palestinian. You can always find that in any society, from Palestine to Afghanistan to Egypt to Iraq. There's always that Palestinian who is ready to negotiate and sell out for personal gains. When I talk about centering Palestinian voices, I am only referring to the organic intellectuals of the Palestinian society, people who reflect the sentiments, wishes, feelings, aspirations, and popular politics of ordinary people. And there are more of these people than you can possibly imagine. Gaza is filled with them right now. Not any Palestinian, therefore, suffice, and not any narrative will do. This should help us liberate the word Sumud and all adjacent terminology from being fleeting sentimental language, and place it at the heart of the Palestinian discourse. The Palestinian people, like all native populations struggling for their freedom, should be trusted with their own discourse. They should not be marginals in that discourse. They should not be in the audience. They should be at the center of the stage of any conversation regarding Palestine. And by the way, they are not a liability to that discourse. They are not marginal actors. They are the main characters. And I have a simple way of proving this. For years, in fact, for decades, we have been begging mainstream media to tell the story of Palestine with a little bit of fairness, just a little bit of a humanity. At least recognize that the Palestinians exist, that they have a viewpoint, that they are people with rights. Give them a little bit of space, a little bit of room, to the point that whenever the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of these arrogant elitist media would allow a Palestinian voice, quite often self-censored, not to hurt, not to shock the audiences too much. Whenever they allow for a little bit of space to that Palestinian or pro-Palestinian voice, it's a big celebration for us in the Solidarity community. Or it used to be. It was a big event. My gosh, can you believe the New York Times allowed this to be published? Because we were always under the impression that we were 1 or 2 or 10 articles away from changing the narrative on Palestine. And of course, it's wrong, because corporate media, by definition, is corporate media, and it's there to serve the interest of the corporations and the state. We all know that. Noam Chomsky has been writing about it forever. Antonio Gramsci has been talking about cultural hegemony for decades and decades ago, right? So we all know that, but somehow we felt beleaguered. We need mainstream media to say something, to take a moral stance. But it turned out that even though Israel disallowed mainstream media from entering Gaza, targeted journalists killed over 220. I think the number is higher now, and injured many, and many were arrested, tortured, many were forced to flee Gaza. Yet somehow, within about 600 days of the Israeli genocide in Gaza, total cut off, total isolation, and a state of total exterminations, Palestinians in Gaza alone have exposed Zionism more than all the work that all the intellectuals and all the academics, mainstream or alternatives, that have done over the course of a century. This is a byproduct of Sumud. It's a byproduct of Sumud. So it is time to revisit our language of solidarity with Palestine, liberate our own ideological, political, and often personal priorities, and reshape it based on the priorities of the Palestinian people. I'm just going to finish with a very quick note that was written by Hussam Shabat, a young Palestinian journalist who was killed by Israel. He wrote, a year before his martyrdom, his recent martyrdom, he wrote this note on social media. He says the biggest problem is not Western journalists being unable to enter Gaza, but the fact that Western media does not respect and value Palestinian journalism. My colleagues and I risk our lives daily to report on this devastation. No one knows Gaza as we do, and no one understands the complexities like we do. If you care about Gaza, amplify Palestinian voices. We do not need Western journalists to tell our stories. We are capable of reporting our own. And I would say, take that maxim and apply it to every form of life and resistance and struggle and politics in Palestine. It is time that we really relocate the discourse on Palestine entirely back to Palestine, to the Palestinians, and to Gaza in particular. Thank you for listening.
Testing. Okay. Next, we have Phyllis Bennis again. Again, she is a fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington and serves as international advisor to Jewish Voices for Peace and author of the just published Understanding Palestine and Israel. Phyllis will talk to us about the Jewish Voices for Peace and the Ceasefire campaign. Phyllis, the floor is yours.
Thanks for a powerful introduction, Ramzy. Greatly appreciated. I'm actually not just going to talk about Jewish Voice for Peace because that's only one of several parts of a movement here in the US. I talked earlier about the importance of global movements that played such a key role 50 years ago in the struggle against South African apartheid that helped change the conditions under which South Africans for themselves were struggling against apartheid. I think the same thing is important now about global movements changing the international situation within which Palestinians themselves are struggling for liberation. But I'm going to talk today, just now, specifically about the United States movement, not about the global movement per se. It is the movement that faces perhaps the biggest challenge anywhere in the world, but is also the most necessary because of the primary role that the United States plays in enabling and participating in Israel's genocide in Gaza right now. What we saw in the very early stages of this section of the genocide, as we might say, right after the October events began, was that what emerged in the United States, globally as well, but particularly visible in the United States, was really two separate movements. There was a long-standing Palestinian rights movement that had been around for 25, 30, 35 years, that had operated for a long time, but had never operated close to power, had never reached positions of proximity to power. Separate from that, initially called out by that movement, by the Palestinian rights movement, but what quickly became a spontaneous, much broader movement was the movement for ceasefire as it defined itself. And that movement was first, as I say, called out by the Palestinian, Muslim, Jewish, Black, Indigenous, other organizations that called people into the streets in those first few days, first few weeks of this genocidal assault. But very soon, that movement emerged as a separate phenomenon, separate from the existing, more organized Palestinian-led movement that had been around for so long. And that movement, the ceasefire movement, achieved two very important things that seem counterintuitive, but they both happened. They were both important. The first was there was a level of message discipline that emerged, which I must say the longstanding Palestinian rights movement was not known for. There were always lots of different positions being asserted at any given moment. But as this movement, the ceasefire movement, emerged, it took up the call, ceasefire now was the call. And the fundamentals that many, many people within it, but not everybody, agreed with, the need to end occupation, to end apartheid, to end settler colonialism, to establish equality for all, these fundamentals were essentially put on the back seat in the context of building a movement broad enough to counter this level of genocide that was underway. The second thing that that movement accomplished was it immediately began to redefine what ceasefire required. So first, ceasefire now immediately became ceasefire now and permanent. It has to start now and it must be permanent. But then it defined ceasefire as being not just one thing, but three things, all of which had to be present for this ceasefire to be what we are fighting for. So the first was certainly stop firing, stop bombing, stop the drone strikes, stop the airstrikes, stop the tank fire, stop shooting and killing people. That was number one. Number two was get UNRWA back in and allow unlimited humanitarian aid for this population that is now already starting to experience starvation, not just hunger. And number three, and perhaps most important in the context of this being a movement in the United States, stop sending weapons. That was both a medium and long-term goal and an immediate goal. There was the understanding that when the weapon stops, the attacks stop. And the United States in that way was not just complicit in, not just enabling, but was actually a participant in this assault. So stopping the weapons was number three. And you had to start with all of those if it was going to be an acceptable ceasefire. So it started with the activists, led by Palestinians first, and then went broader. And the broader part was not even a political response. It was a human response that involved, right from the beginning, people who had never engaged with the issue of Palestine, had never supported Palestinian rights particularly. Many had never been activists at all. Many came from other movements, the environmental justice movement, immigrant rights, the women's movement, LGBTQ rights, all of these things, the labor movement, the Black freedom movement, all were involved. But there was a huge component of people for whom day-to-day activism was not part of their life on any issue. And yet they were pulled in to what was rapidly becoming the moral challenge, the moral issue of our time, especially for young people of all those communities. So first it was the Black freedom movement that emerged, Black Lives Matter, Black for Palestine, Black Christians for Palestine, other African-American organizations that emerged, other communities of color, indigenous movements, the notion what we heard about a minute ago about this statement from Shaked when she was the justice minister who talked about snakes was so reminiscent of the discourse that existed in this country in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, during what was known as the Indian Wars, in Sand Creek, the famous, infamous Sand Creek massacre, where a commander told his troops to fire and kill everyone in a village on Sand Creek in Colorado. Some of his soldiers came back and said, we can't shoot these people. They're a peaceful people. They're sleeping. It's the middle of the night. There's babies, there's children. And his answer was, nits make lice. Kill them all. Kill them all. It was the same language that we heard, the same language of extermination of a population that we heard from then Justice Minister in Israel. The student movement, the incredible student movement that emerged through social media. And again, not all were experienced protesters at that time. They came out in response to what they were seeing on their phones, on their screens, on their tablets and computers and televisions, 24/7 on a daily basis. And they established on their campuses these encampments that were both symbolic of the Nakba and symbolic of resistance, became the symbols of the entire movement, led by these extraordinary students. 175, 200 campuses had these encampments as symbolic of the protest, of the demand of the students that their own universities divest from profiting from apartheid and occupation and settler colonialism and now genocide. It was a link to earlier protests, certainly to the Vietnam era protests that talked about strategic hamlets, what this new project is from Israel and the United States right now inside Gaza, to shove the entire population into a tiny area so that the rest of the land can be destroyed, the rest of the people can be slaughtered. Strategic hamlets was the name of this this horrific plan in the Vietnam era. It was also reminiscent of the anti-apartheid struggle of the 1980s, of 50 years ago, when students built what were made to look like the settlements, the shanty towns that Black South Africans were forced to live in during the years of apartheid. So this was both symbolic of a history of political organizing, of movements, of student organizing, but it was also specific to the Nakba and to resistance of Palestinians. We then saw a movement that was led by a number of Jewish organizations, both anti-Zionist Jews and other Jews who were not necessarily ready to call themselves anti-Zionists, but could not fathom being part of and standing by and not dissociating themselves from the horrors that they were seeing that was being perpetrated in the name of Jewish safety, keeping Jews safe. And people were saying, not in our name. That does not keep us safe. Not in our name became the cry of that part of the movement. Jewish Voice for Peace, the largest of the, well, this one is an anti-Zionist organization, but the largest of any Jewish organization criticizing, condemning Israeli occupation, apartheid, and genocide, doubled in size despite a decision not to do any recruiting as long as this is going on, because it just seemed wrong to recruit on the basis of this. But people flooded to the organization despite that, holding sit-ins in congressional offices, occupying Grand Central Station in New York City, occupying the island where the Statue of Liberty is based. New organizations, Rabbis for Ceasefire, emerged, occupied the Security Council chambers at the United Nations, protesting how their country, the United States, was preventing the United Nations from doing its job, and then went to meet with the Secretary General to say to him the same thing. We know what our government is doing to keep the pressure on you. Our president does not speak for Jews in this country. All of that has been going on. The Jewish elders who chained themselves to the White House fence in protest, and crucially, challenging the weaponization of these false charges of anti-Semitism that were being used primarily against the students. It was crucial that that critique came first from the Jewish students within the encampments. It didn't prevent, of course, that weaponization that is still going on. We're still seeing this in the United States, where people are now facing deportation, detention, on the basis of false claims of anti-Semitism, draconian punishments that were already being used by the universities to kick out students who were simply protesting and demanding that their universities divest from apartheid and occupation. So what that reflected, among other things, was a reality that had been going on for maybe 10 years that was largely generational, but not only in the Jewish community, beginning really with the movement for Black Lives that started in 2014, with the killing of Black activists around the country, leading up to the killing of George Floyd in 2020, where it spread certainly across the United States, but then globally as well. And what we saw, for example, in 2021, there was a poll of Jewish voters in the United States indicating that 25% of Jewish voters believed Israel was an apartheid state. This was 4 years ago. At that same poll, 38% of young Jewish voters said they believed Israel is an apartheid state. That had never happened in the history of this long-standing movement for Palestinian rights. We had never achieved that level of influence of our ideas within the Jewish community. It showed the impact of years of work, but then it showed what was happening right now and what the vision that Palestinian journalists that Ramzy just spoke of, that have been so important in getting out to the world the reality of what has happened in Gaza. That's what changed that long-standing instinctive report for Israel. So you had this very broad movement, broad in composition, broad and creative in tactics. We were seeing for the first time protests by federal workers, congressional staff, White House interns, the workers at USAID, the State Department, even the election staff workers for the Biden campaign, resignations, people from the State Department, the Education Department, Interior, the Pentagon, all resigning, refusing to be part of the collaboration with genocide that was underway. And it led to a massive public discourse shift. It took us about 20 years to normalize the discourse of apartheid in the United States when talking about Israel. That debate, that discussion began in 2001, 2002, 2003. It wasn't really until around 2021 that that discourse became normalized. 20 years. It took about 20 days to normalize the language of genocide to describe what Israel was doing. And it wasn't only protesters, it was the 800 global academics who study genocide, the Holocaust, atrocity crimes, who came out with a report within the first few weeks of the genocide beginning in Gaza, this round, that said this is a genocide. All of that has changed this massive public discourse. So what we had now was this broad movement. It led in the spring of 2024 to the uncommitted movement within the Democratic Party when the primary elections were underway, when suddenly there were campaigns across the country that led to over 750,000 US voters only in the Democratic Party on this one, whose message was they would not support the man who had increasingly was being called Genocide Joe, that they would not vote for Genocide Joe, who was seen as enabling genocide. Now, they failed to win support in the Democratic Party to change the position of that party. The Republican Party, of course, did not change either. Even at the Democratic National Convention, even a speaker in a tiny slot was denied. A Palestinian speaker was denied any right to speak. But it did make Gaza the major issue in Democratic Party politics, so that when a poll was taken just a couple of months after the election, when voters who voted for Joe Biden in 2020, but refused to vote for him, for his successor, Kamala Harris, in 2024, they were asked, why did you change? Why did you vote for the Democrat in 2020 and not vote for the Democrat in 2024? And that included people who had changed and voted for Trump, people who didn't vote at all, people who voted for Congress but didn't vote for president. It included everyone who had voted once for Biden and refused to vote for Harris. Of that group, they were given 6 options to choose. All of us thought the main one would be the economy, that was the main reason. That was wrong. 29%, the biggest grouping of all those voters, 29% said the reason they did not vote for Harris was because she had the same position as Biden on Gaza. Gaza was what changed it. And that's huge. So we have now this escalation of repression against the whole movement, especially students, from undocumented students to those with temporary documentation, to green card holders, to the threats to US citizens. All of it recognizing that across this movement, Israeli actions constitute genocide. And I will close with just saying that within that movement, the support for the International Court of Justice and the South African initiative to bring Israel to accountability in the ICJ has become a talisman of that movement with massive support, massive support. So the kind of work I spoke about in the earlier panel of using the South Africa model of getting individual countries, in this case, the United States, based on existing international law, has become a huge component of what that work is going to entail. The challenge now is how to build that movement, rebuild the broader component of it, and link it with the broad movement against authoritarianism and the rise of fascism that we are also facing in this country. Thank you.
Have our last session actually focusing on the criminalization of student protests. But first, I want to give it to Haidar to discuss the lessons that we can take from South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle. Haidar is an associate professor of literature and cultural studies at Al-Aqsa University, Gaza, research associate at Nelson Mandela University, and a research associate at the Center for Asian Studies in Africa at the University of Pretoria, and member of the Palestine Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, and a board member of Badil. Haidar, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to join this great panel. And I would like to start by paying tribute to the colleagues that are lost, to more than 38 colleagues of mine from Al-Aqsa University, or rather what used to be Al-Aqsa University. And I would like also to pay tribute to more than 208 students from Al-Aqsa University as well. Just before I start talking about the South African analogy and lessons learned from South Africa, I would also like to add that I'm a genocide survivor. I spent the first 2 months of the genocide in Gaza, and I was displaced 3 times in Gaza until I was evacuated with other South Africans from Gaza together with my family. I am a naturalized South African of Palestinian origin. I spent 5 to 6 years actually in the Republic of South Africa, starting from 1997. That's to say 3 years after the first multiracial elections, which ultimately led to the appointment of Nelson Mandela as the first Black president of the country. Those were actually turbulent years. What with the specter of apartheid looming after ruling for about 46 years, leaving scars that the people of South Africa, in their various races, in fact, still have to deal with. What concerns me actually here is the fact that not a single country in the world, of course with very, very few exceptions of like Israel, in the late 1980s wanted to have anything to do with the inhumane apartheid system. Not even recognizing the so-called independent homelands given as a bribe to some native Africans by the apartheid regime at that time. Now, it is noteworthy that the international community considers the crime of apartheid as one of the gravest crimes against humanity after genocide, as argued by our legal experts of this tribunal. This is why, as a Palestinian descendant of refugees from the ethnically cleansed village of Zarnuqa in the district of Ramzy, I'm entitled to my internationally sanctioned right of return. And this is why I take issue with the support of the two-state solution as one that is considered by the so-called international community as the solution that fulfills the national aspirations of Israelis and Palestinians. That is to say, the colonizer and the colonized. Now, as a resident of Gaza, I seem actually to be in constant shock that there are politicians who still believe that there are two equal sides to what they call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I wonder, sorry, because I'm still suffering from flu, and I wonder whether these same politicians believed in the 1970s and 80s that there were two equal parties in South Africa, white and black, with equal claim to the land. Unlike the post-apartheid, or unlike the new post-apartheid South Africa, in the state of Israel, all human beings are not equal. Israel now defines itself as a Jewish state. And since almost 22% of the citizens of Israel are of Palestinian origin, they are excluded from being equal citizens of that state, let alone the more than 4 million Palestinians living under direct military occupation in the Gaza extermination camp and the West Bank. And therefore, we need always to remember when we make that comparison that the first thing to look at is that Israel, by definition, is not a state of its citizens, but one of the Jewish people, most of whom have no birthright connection to it. So one can be a citizen of any country in the world, yet as Jews, they enjoy full rights in Israel, rights that apartheid Israel denies to us Palestinians, the indigenous population of the land. They also refer to us as Israeli Arabs, Jerusalem residents, Arabs of the territories, Palestinians or Arabs of the diaspora, etc., etc. And to add insult to injury, there is no Israeli nationality. Instead, there is Jewish nationality, much like there was a white nationality in apartheid South Africa. So if one is born to Palestinian parents living in Israel, you too would be denied the rights of Jewish nationality and be forced to submit to institutionalized inferiority or choose to resist resist this inferiority, which is the natural reaction of any decent human being, like the choices made by Nelson Mandela and even Martin Luther King. The same racist laws used to forbid Black property ownership in white areas in apartheid South Africa are enforced in apartheid Israel. Every single apartheid law in South Africa has an equivalent one in Israel. Israel calls them basic laws. And what I would like to emphasize is the similarities between apartheid and the exclusive Zionist nature of Israel. And let me be actually more specific. The Land Act, for example, in 1913 in South Africa, defined 87% of South Africa as white territory, pushing the Black majority of the land and limiting them only to 13% of it. A second law is the Population Registration Act in 1950, resulted in the formal classification of people into whites, Indians, coloreds, and Africans. The Mixed Marriage Act of 1955 prohibited Africans from the Immorality Act in 1957 outlawed marriages and relationships across the racial lines. But then the Group Act of 1955 prohibited Africans from being present in South Africa, white South Africa, for more than 72 hours. Now, every single Palestinian can relate to this, can understand that. Now, coming back to Israel, on May 14th, 1948, the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel, was declared. Israel is one of the few countries that has no constitution and has instead adopted a set of basic laws. In 1985, the character of Israel as a Jewish state was reaffirmed in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. In 2017, the Knesset endorsed the so-called nation-state law, declaring Israel as the state of Jews only, not of its citizens. Now, and then you have the law of return, and then you have the population registry law of 1965, which requires all residents of Israel to register their ethnic group and religion within the population registry. And I myself, for example, I have legal title to my parents' land in Zarnuka, in Israel. But I have no legal right to it right now in practice because my parents' property, like that of millions of other Palestinians, was taken away from us and given over to Jewish ownership. And I think that comparison is like a background that we need to understand. Apartheid in Palestine is one of the forms of the multi-tiered forms of oppression in Israel-Palestine. And I think that now, with the ongoing, yesterday I was sitting with my friend, my comrade Ronnie Kasrels. Everybody knows Ronnie, and we were talking about one of his articles in which he argues that apartheid was a picnic. This is not to belittle the suffering of the Black population in South Africa, but was a picnic compared to what is happening right now in Palestine. So in light of the ongoing live stream genocide and the urgent need for the mobilization of international solidarity with the Palestinian people, one needs to re-ask some fundamental questions. And the immediate and urgent task to be addressed is the nature of this international solidarity and the best ways of enhancing it. And I think what needs to be emphasized, first and foremost, actually, is the Bantustanization, or rather the Bantustanizing nature of settler colonial Zionism. Now, the problem is that the severe damage the Oslo Accords signed in 1993 between the official leadership of the Palestinian people and apartheid Israel, they have caused huge damage to the Palestinian question, and in the way they contributed to diverting the international attention from the suffering of the Palestinian people, the Palestinian refugees. And the Oslo Accords have made it more difficult for people of conscience to show support to the Palestinian question. And I think the international community has, or rather had the feeling after the Oslo Accord that it does not hold responsibility in eliminating the roots of the suffering of the Palestinian people. Now, the fact that most Black South Africans accepted the Bantustan systems did not convince the international community of the legitimacy and humanity of apartheid. And I think we need to take that into consideration. And I think, you know, the current situation in Gaza and in the Palestinian occupied territories has been very well documented. The statistics show higher level of Palestinian deaths, disabilities, home demolitions, and poverty than at any other time since the Nakba in 1948. The siege against the Palestinians of Gaza, and I was there. I witnessed the siege since its beginning in 2007. I was there in 2008 and 2009 when apartheid Israel decided to launch a massive attack for 22 days, killing more than 1,400 people, the overwhelming majority of whom were children and women. I was there in 2012, and I was there in 2014. I participated in the Great March of Return, and I saw with my own eyes the horrific crimes committed by Israeli soldiers. But at the same time, we need to admit that there is an internal crisis of Palestinian leadership, with the Palestinian factions being unable to agree to the terms of, a unity of government, national unity. And that has left us, and has left actually Palestinian civil society divided at a time when it is imperative that Palestinians, that we show unity against the Israeli occupation, apartheid, and settler colonialism. And this is why we believe that the example of South Africa has a role to play in Palestine today. I think not only can we learn about Israel by examining apartheid in South Africa, but we can also help to take the Palestinian cause forward by learning from the South African anti-apartheid struggle. The manner in which it framed its objectives and the strategies and tactics that it used, particularly the successful campaign by the South African anti-apartheid movement and the South African forces in isolating South African apartheid. I believe this is an experience that we should examine and then adopt from and employ whatever might be useful in the new apartheid context in Palestine. Now, the South African struggle against apartheid is generally understood. Most of the Palestinian activists understand the South African struggle against apartheid, but not many, especially Palestinian nationalist movement, doesn't know that the South African struggle was based on what was called the 4 pillars of resistance, the 4 pillars of struggle. 1, international solidarity and international isolation of the apartheid state. BDS, that was 1. 2, the internal resistance. 3, the armed struggle. And 4, the underground movement. And it is generally accepted that the first 2 pillars, that is to say, the isolation of apartheid through an international solidarity movement and the internal resistance, they were the most significant and effective in bringing about an end to the brutal and racist apartheid regime. And I think in the South African context, the campaign to isolate apartheid included a number, which Phyllis actually alluded to, a number of focus areas. And these included, which we need in Palestine right now, military sanctions and military embargo against apartheid, political and diplomatic isolation, economic sanctions, an academic boycott, and I am on the advisory committee of PACI, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, and we issued our first statement calling on the international academic institutions and cultural institutions and figures to boycott apartheid academic institutions for not only their complicity, actually for their involvement in the crimes against humanity and war crimes committed against the Palestinian people. And the 5th point is a cultural and a sporting boycott. And I think that to finish, after almost complete isolation through all of the above mentioned points that I've just alluded to, together with the internal resistance within South Africa, the South African apartheid regime was finally forced to make certain compromises. And the world saw the unbanning of the various liberation movements and the beginning of the negotiations that led to South Africa's first democratic elections and the beginning of the attempt to realize, the slogan, one person, one vote in a non-racial, non-sexist democratic South Africa. All of the mentioned areas of struggle are up for consideration for us now in Palestine. In our struggle to isolate apartheid Israel, they need to be examined in terms of their efficacy in the South African struggle and adopted to be used in the Palestinian struggle. Each one of these points will require, I admit, detailed programs of action and will have to be resourced with information, material, propaganda, and activists. And will need to have its own structures to take it forward in a coordinated and effective manner. And I believe this is what the Palestinian-led global BDS movement is doing right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Haidar. And to close off this panel, we're going to put the focus on the student protests and the criminalization of those student protests. And this will be covered by Asmer Safi. Asmer Safi is a recent graduate of Harvard College, where he was a former member of Harvard Out of Occupied Palestine Coalition from Lahore, Pakistan. He is currently pursuing Masters of Philosophy in Intellectual History at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, where he studies Muslim socialist thought. Asmer, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the important work being done here and for the opportunity that the Gaza Tribunal has provided me. As I've said before as well, I'm a member of the student movement, but I'm also a student of the movement itself. And I think there's a lot that I've learned personally from this panel, particularly the remarks that were made by Dr. Ramzy Baroud about Sumud, and some of the reflections that I've had on the student movement I'll be sharing as well, with regards to how certain language and the sentimentality behind it is not necessarily taken as seriously as we would want to, particularly when we're sort of squaring off the repression and the criminalization of student protest with what is happening in Gaza and in Palestine itself as tragedies unfold in real time. But to give some more context about myself, so I'm a student organizer from Pakistan. I'd been organizing with the Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee for over the last 4 years on the cause of divestment broadly, but also protesting particular initiatives that were launched by Harvard, which now maintains global limelight as one of the institutions that are now challenging the Trump administration. But, undergirding that kind of challenge is a lot that has been done to sort of subsume Palestine protest, any academic initiative that has to do with Palestine, but also more broadly, the kind of complicity that has existed through investments in arms manufacturing, in companies that are complicit in both the genocide in Gaza, but also in the systems of apartheid and occupation more broadly. I'm currently based at Oxford, organizing with the Rhodes Scholars for Palestine and other various organizations that are based at Oxford to champion the cause of divestment there as well. I would also like to specifically say at the beginning of my remarks that my views on the student organizing are rooted, in fact, in my experience, and it is a movement like any other social movement that is marked by a lot of internal diversity, particularly in the post-encampment moment where we saw mobilizations across the world, not just in the United States, but across the world, where there was this unified sort of physical space that kind of gave an impetus for students to congregate and then also simultaneously have organizing conversations about what divestment looks like, what the future of the university in and of itself looks like in a marked physical space. Since then, since the encampment moment has kind of dwindled, there is a difference of opinions in goals, in tactics, in responses to oppression, and even if there's any value in discussing the side of oppression, considering the atrocities that are being done in real time in Gaza. And so this is a diverse discourse in and of itself, and this was the case across, from what we know about the history of the anti-Vietnam War struggle, the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, and something that we think is incredibly productive to be having as a discourse continually. And a reminder for ourselves is that as we approach the 600th day since the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, and new forms of violence are being enacted in all of their horrific manifestations. It becomes all the more important to ensure that our work and the repression it does face in the United States, in the United Kingdom, elsewhere in the world, as civil society activists and student movement builders continue to do the work that they're doing, does not distract from the tragedies unfolding itself, which has in recent time become the focus of liberalism. And there's the one part of it that allows us to be able to build a broad-based movement, a movement that is based on countering authoritarianism, on countering things like the attack on free speech, the attack on academic freedom, but also very, very important to do at the same time is being able to center why Palestine is the reason why these attacks are happening in the first place, and the ways in which sort of our own discourses can distract to these broader sort of liberal issues without having to actively, counter the issues of occupation, apartheid, and genocide, which I think has been the case in the United States more recently in a lot of different ways. I will be framing the conversation in terms of lessons that I have personally learned, and I think more broadly has been subject of discourse in the student movement and how they can instruct us for the way forward. To give more context, I was one of the 13 students that Harvard barred from graduating in May 2024 over my role in helping organize the encampment in Harvard Yard. But just to be able to situate what this, being barred for graduation looked like was the kind of berserk natures by which repression itself was being enacted. The case that was presented against me was not that because, I disrupted educational activity or that I was, setting up camp or tents in the middle of Harvard Yard, but because I used a microphone, quite literally. The idea was that because my voice exceeded a certain decibel level that was legally sanctioned by Harvard University, which doesn't necessarily be implemented. This restriction is necessarily not implemented in any case of other protests. Noise amplification was a charge that was used against me to be able to dismiss me from being able to graduate. And this is the kind of sort of frivolous nature by which repression is now being enacted. And we've seen continually, there's obviously the more overt sort of example and the more aggressive examples of, police repression and the NYPD being called on Columbia students and stuff of that nature. But there's also a more subtle way of trying to be able to clamp down on student protests in a way that escapes the public eye. But, the excuses that are being used, administrators know that they're frivolous, students know that they're frivolous, but the way in which they're enacted sort of feeds this broader narrative of the criminalization of student protest. At the time, we thought that this was the worst that it would ever be. But however, it is also important to know that this refrain, that this repression that we are facing is the worst that it has ever been or will be, is not new. And we've recurrently faced, having to confront this refrain on multiple occasions while we've been organizing for Palestine, and for other causes as well, but more particularly in the case of Palestine, particularly when, in the post-Trump moment, we had, the abduction of Mahmoud Khalil, Rumesa Usturk, Badr Khan Suri, all these people, and the repression completely changed from being something that we had witnessed, something that we were able to sort of come to grasp with over the course of the last year. But the nature of that completely shifted. It is also important to go back into the past because in March 2023, which is pre-genocide, pre-October 7th, was when I was first doxxed, and Canary Mission was able to upload a profile about me over a video that I made for Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee about the nature of the apartheid regime that was posted on Instagram. And as a consequence of that, 60 of my videos, images, documents that I had signed on, a personal biography, all of these things were put online. The same response we also had, the same refrain we also addressed when, the doxing truck, a truck that, was carrying the names of Palestine activists, calling them Harvard's leading anti-Semites and other universities' leading anti-Semites, was, parading around university campuses and cities with our images and our faces on them. And administrators at these universities refused to comply to protect students under pressure from donors, billionaires, corporation leaders, and the general corporate interests that they've been beholden to, as we've seen over the course of the last year. And so it is very, very pertinent to understand that these forms of repression at every given step have been conceived by us as perhaps the worst that it could get in the United States and elsewhere in the world, but they've only propelled themselves into, a larger magnitude, into ways that we would have never imagined them to be manifesting. But I think simultaneously what has been happening within organizing circles, within student circles, is that, defying repression is something that we've come to terms with as something that is second nature to this kind of organizing. And this comes from also understanding the infrastructure behind, the exception to Palestine free speech that has existed for the longest term, but also understanding that, it keeps getting worse in different ways, and it has and most likely will continue to. This is not to say that it does not come at a lot of human cost to a lot of individuals that are coming from disprivileged backgrounds that are at risk. But at the same time, in the organizing sense, it is important to also understand that this repression in and of itself is what gets people moving at a lot of times. And as a product demonstrates the contradictions between sort of perverted ideals of the university, of liberalism more generally, of the American sort of consensus, and the ways in which, through this repression and through the ways in which it is being enacted, we are able to lay bare the contradictions intrinsic to these institutions and the corporate rot that is, intrinsic to these institutions. I think one of the biggest lessons that we have been able to learn over the course of the last year is that we need to be able to expose them for what they are. And I think this is something that needs to guide our communication strategy. This is the kind of thing that needs to be able to sort of tell us the ways in which there exists a double standard, a dilemma in which universities and their principals are constantly in contention with the ways in which their actions are being sort of deployed for suppressing student protest. The second lesson, and this is more on the nature of radicalization in and of itself, right? I think a lot of what we see is that when students are banned from graduating, or when the police is called on them in Colombia, or when things start to, be suppressed in an overt nature, that's when students begin to react. That's when people generally begin to react. This is the same case with also the abductions that are happening at the behest of ICE in the United States. And matters quickly turn into a discussion on providing, international students with rights, protecting freedom of speech, academic freedom, all of which are necessarily under attack. But these attacks are also a product of a threat conceived to these ideals and the neoliberal, broadly hegemonic order that appeared only in the aftermath of the shift that was caused by Palestine organizing. And so more importantly, what becomes so pertinent is that our job is now to center the threat that this kind of discourse does pose. To continually push the world we want to see, which, like Rabia Baria, who is a scholar of Palestine legal studies, does not allow the ongoing Nakba to proceed undeterred. The genocide should be enough to be able to get people to care, but the world where we live in currently is not something that is allowing that to happen. The way in which these discourses continually take away from what is happening in Palestine and become a cause of concern for the student protests generally is to be able to shift the discourse in a way that focuses on the violations of rights, the ways in which genocide, occupation, and apartheid are being enacted, as opposed to just, the legal rights of citizens in the United States. The third lesson, and this is more intrinsic to the university in and of itself, is about being able to pushing the limits of discourse in and of itself. One thing that we learned very, very early on with the encampment experience was the fact that we were being taught things as a part of teaching, as a part of solidarity panels, as a part of professors coming to the encampment and having these conversations with us, is that there is a lot in our educational experience in and of itself that is missing from what we want to be learning and from what we want to be experiencing as students. And a lot of that is also obviously nurtured in a climate of fear that, again, pre-existed the genocide. What now becomes important is not only to realize that there is a shift in consensus within this young demographic, people that are operating as university students, but also simultaneously realizing that these pedagogical shifts now need to start taking place within the university in and of itself, where people need to be responding to the kind of ways in which students want to be educated. Discussions that we do not need to be disrupting anything for, that encampments should not be the only place where temporarily we can have these kind of existing decisions. And I think a broader sort of focus on political education as part of our university education, where the responsibility of the students is to be able to reclaim the university from within. And a lot of what I'm seeing right now happening at Oxford is a series of talks in conjunction with departments, in conjunction with student organizations that are completely taking the university by storm, because they're, every single individual event is focused on Palestine, on Sudan, on the Congo, on ways in which all of these different issues, these genocides, these occupations kind of intersect, and the ways in which, the world is not responding to them the way that we really need to. And I think the kind of consensus that caused to shift when, this is the default education that you're being able to provide to these students is something that marks a shift in the kind of discourse that is not only available, but also the kind of limits that you want to continue to push as a consequence. At the same time, it is also important to understand that students pass and go throughout universities. You know, a lot of us have graduated from Harvard, a lot of us will continue to graduate from our respective master's postgrad programs. But in order for us to be able to build up institutional memory, one of the things that, you know, has been a common refrain within the student movement is this idea of whether the tenured can speak. And so the responsibility of academics is not necessarily only to pass statements, or to be able to sort of, you know, provide consensus against what is happening in Palestine, but also to take the pedagogical focus within their own ambit and within the mandate of their own teaching, but also simultaneously understand that they are pillars of what constitutes student organizing, and they are, you know, locuses of, you know, both moral organizing, but also simultaneously allowing us to learn what political organizing looked like before our time at particular institutions, and being able to show us, you know, the ways in which we can be able to go forward, and simultaneously are an ally against the, you know, this broad bare university administration that is, you know, hell-bent on being able to repress students. And I think, you know, a big sort of leeway that, you know, students do not have is something that is present within faculties and within staffs that have, you know, settled sort of organizational jobs with these universities, and the ways in which these can be leveraged for political organizing. The fourth thing that I think is very, very important to understand is that there is a level of strategic stagnation right now happening within the university organizing scene. This is also accompanied by delaying tactics on part of university organizers, private commitments that are made by university administrators that are followed up then by public refusals, and the language of creating, you know, sort of two-sided discourses, negotiations being offered as appeasement, you know, particularly de-escalate student actions. And it is very, very important to understand that a lot of the organizations within this organizing that happens within this context has been reactionary, has been in response to particular things that are happening on campus, has been in response to repression that is happening on campus, particularly in the encampment moment where you saw a lot of that happening. Right now, the goal of the student movement should not necessarily just be to, you know, keep that reactionary locus up, but also to be able to build a scaffolding for organizing, and organizing necessarily as we understand it and have understood it as a consequence of the last year in particular, where there was a lot of momentum to be able to regroup, to rethink the ways in which, you know, political mobilization has been happening and the things that get people riled up, is to understand that we need to build a scaffolding where internally there needs to become now an infrastructure for being able to respond not only just to threats, but to be able to carry a conversation forward in a more positive orientation. This is focused on things like political education. This is focused on being able to investigate precedents for divestment. This is focused on things like political fundraising, and to be able to understand the overall infrastructure through research, through, you know, being able to, you know, launch freedom of information requests in the United Kingdom, but also to broadly understand the nature and the infrastructure mechanisms of repression and how they operate. The day that we were handed suspensions at Harvard almost a year ago now is also the same day that we saw Jonathan Ziblatt of the Anti-Defamation League walking out of President Alan Garber's office. And, you know, that sort of moment is something that I feel like has been concurrently a part of how we viewed organizing, because it shows that, you know, the ways in which we're operating against the Zionist movement and their sort of perpetrators in the United States has been so incredibly interconnected with, you know, the powers that be at our universities, but also beyond. And the timing of these things exposes the fact that these interests collude over and over again. This has, you know, become apparent in the surveillance of students. This has become apparent in the arrests that have been made and the timings at which that have happened, particularly owing to the ways in which, you know, there has been an outcry against how the universities are being so appeasing of Palestine protesters and being so soft on them. And so part of our job is to be able to, you know, leverage this radicalization movement for what it is. Students across the globe are doing this from all backgrounds and find themselves shifting the needle on discourse about Palestine, but also internally what kind of university they want to see, but simultaneously also understanding on a very, very personal level how this infrastructure of repression has been, you know, mobilized against not only pro-Palestine voices, but any voice that decides to challenge American hegemony, Western hegemony, and authoritarianism in the ways that has been unseen, that has been invisibilized across the last couple of decades. So I will end my remarks there. Thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you for listening. And I hope that this was instructive in being able to talk about the criminalization of student protest.
Thank you to all the panelists of Panel 5 and all the panelists for Chamber 2 today. I wanted to give an opportunity to Craig to close out the discussion on Chamber 2. If you have some closing remarks you'd like to give, Craig. I know we've kept you up a while, and I really appreciate your time. So, just 1 second.
I'll wait until the audio is resolved and somebody can give me a cue. Okay, I think we've got it resolved. I'm going to trust that you can hear me. It's been a very exciting day. It's been a frustrating day, of course, with the technical difficulties that we've had, but we've managed to get through a very, very heavy but very enlightening program as well. I don't know if there's energy left in the room for a discussion. I will pose a couple of questions. You can take them home with you or use them to engage now as you prefer. But let me first thank Penny for her very skilled chairing of the day, and to all of the outstanding panelists and presenters and the moderators for the very hard work and the very excellent production that they shared with us all today. We've had a chance today to look at so many different facets of the challenges of Palestinian freedom, particularly, of course, as they present themselves in the international sphere, the geopolitical challenges, all of the institutional shortcomings that we've discussed, accountability gaps, the myriad gross violations that comprise the Zionist project for the annihilation of Palestine. But we also heard today about the power of Palestinian Sumud, steadfastness, the power of resistance, and the power of solidarity through civil society, social movements, and people's tribunals like this one. That's all going to be extremely helpful to the work of the tribunal. And I think what we heard today is helpful as well to the broader movement for Palestinian liberation and to human rights globally. But still, I'm thinking that even as we recognize this, there's this nagging tug at our conscience that demands to know, how do we stop this? We wake up every day to new images of horror in Palestine. We see the videos, we hear the screams, we learn the new unfathomable numbers, new world records for depravity and mass murder coming out of Palestine every day. And we wake up to new demonstrations of complicity by the regime's allies, the governments that rule over many of us who are participating in this conference, and to the disgraceful propaganda of Western media corporations and Israel proxies. And conscience demands to know, what can we do to stop this now? Not next year, but now. How can we disrupt the global mechanism of oppression and genocide now? And ultimately, down the road, defeat it and dismantle it. And I think, we, just like millions of people around the world who have shown themselves ready to take action, are ready to do everything, everywhere, all at once, just to make it stop. So how, the question is, can we turn these lessons into action? This tribunal includes some great thinkers and public intellectuals, but it is not an academic exercise, and it must not become one, in my view. We want to challenge power. We want to change this intolerable reality. And this tribunal, in the coming weeks and months, has to dedicate itself to answering that question first and foremost. And we would welcome, of course, your thoughts from this chamber and all of the chambers that have been working over the past couple of days and will work tomorrow as well. Okay, while we think about that, Here's another question of direct relevance to our panel today. And if anyone wants to intervene to sort of offer some responses to this, that's fine. Or if you want to take it with you to inform your inputs into the tribunal subsequently, that's fine as well. We've been talking about the international system. And the next big event at the international level will be the International Conference on Palestine that's set to take place at the United Nations headquarters in New York in June. Now, that conference will bring opportunities for our cause. I'm sure it will. But it also brings serious risks. You can be sure that as we are speaking right now, many states are working to ensure that the UN conference will be used more as a vehicle to return to the status quo ante of October 2023. The empty rhetoric of a two-state solution, an endless and disingenuous political process like Oslo, the sidelining of international law and human rights, as we saw for over 30 years, the erasure of the historic ICJ advisory opinions of the last year, normalization in the middle of a genocide. You can bet that's what's being planned by many delegations that will participate in the conference in New York, to bring back the requirement that Palestinians must negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, maybe in exchange recognizing a Palestinian Bantustan, but guaranteeing impunity for Israeli perpetrators, and another smokescreen, like Oslo, another smokescreen for further Israeli conquest and settlement and annexation of Palestine. So my question, again, you're welcome to respond to it now or to take it with you to further feed the kinds of issues that we discussed today, is this: what must we demand in the outcome of the UN conference in June that would prevent a backward step in the movement for Palestinian liberation? Because bet that there are delegations trying very hard to make sure that it is a backward step and not another step forward toward liberation. What do we want from this conference? Penny, I don't know if there are any takers. I can understand that people there must be very exhausted, as I am, having gone through this without sleep here in New York. But if there are any, I'll turn the floor back over to you, and if not, back to you to wrap it up with my thanks to you and everyone in the room and online. Thank you.
For that sort of, I don't know, that rallying cry, it's what we need. We do have one question, and Johnny is going to raise it. And I think, are there any other questions? We'll make Johnny's the one and only. The one question is...
Yep, and I think Ramzy wanted to come in with a reaction, and Phyllis as well, if we can maybe extend by a few minutes.
Very concrete, without knowing too well what is the organization of the conference in June. But I wonder whether all the experience that we have accumulated with these three chambers and now with this declaration, I think that I wonder whether that could be one way of possibly anticipating your conclusion, because I think most of the things will be, it's difficult to produce more knowledge from here to October for this Gaza tribunal. I wonder whether, in order to show really the urgency and the need for a pressure from the people and the public opinion point of view, combined with such a high level of examination of different aspects, if that could be one way of showing to the international state community that they cannot pretend to leave out from the consideration all the protests, the interest, and the movements which have been really very active, both inside the academic, also the movements. Everybody in the world has said that something should be stopped. Now we have simply an opportunity for the Gaza Tribunal to be the sum, or the really the clear an actor which is qualifying the significance of this universal judgment on what is happening in Gaza, and to give the point of view of people and not simply of states. Because as far as I can understand, an UN conference, I don't know properly the program is already including, but is mainly concentrated on states instead of giving the visibility and the power to the voice and the presence of the international people's community.
What are the most compelling and important forces and voices that made the change in terms of the global consciousness? I'm here trying to address several points all at the same time. You're going to find that ultimately it's Gaza. I mean, it is Gaza. I mean, you can't play around with this concept. If you remove Gaza on all manifestations of resistance in Gaza, and the fact, assuming that they submitted so quickly to the Israeli army, the fact that, it would have been all said and done. Khalas, it's over. It's over for us. What this discussion is taking place because of Gaza, because of the resistance and the resilience of Gaza. I was born and raised in Gaza, and I inherited the legacy of the Nakba from my parents and my grandparents. And I have been writing and reporting and interviewing people in Palestine throughout my entire career. And I know how history usually manifests itself in these situations. Israel attacks Jenin, it kills the resistance in Jenin, it arrests dozens, if not hundreds of people in Jenin, and at the end of the day, it demolishes Jenin and pushes the reset button on its own occupation over and over and over again. They are incapable of achieving this in Gaza because of the tenacity of the Gazans, the absolute tenacity of the Gazans. So go back to my pie chart and you are going to find that the biggest chunk of all of this is Gaza. Okay. Number two, the solidarity movement, but not just your typical solidarity movement, our conferences and our kind of typical, conversation that we usually have about Gaza, the intellectuals of Palestine and the intellectualization on Palestine and the academic writings about Palestine. There is a new component here that is being led by a solid and equally tenacious audience, or rather group of people, and these are the students. I mean, this is something that, at least in the case of the anti-Vietnam, war, many American students had vested interest in this. They did not want to be drafted to the war. So it's kind of difficult sometimes to tell, was this genuinely morally founded popular movement, or is there kind of a balance between self-interest and other elements? In this case, you have thousands of students who are being deported, arrested, losing their very future, denied diplomas, graduation, kicked out, and they are still persistent. This is different. This is a game changer in the kind of popular movements in the United States, in Europe, and other parts of the world. And that has now to be given a large share of the discussion on Palestine. I think it's very important that we do not prejudice the conversation on Palestine because it's still very early. We still haven't seen the outcomes of all of this, but we are getting cues and clues regarding, the post-Gaza, the post-genocide in Gaza global movement that exists today. So I think we have to be courageous in knowing how to understand and humble enough to be able to interpret these changes in a way that we can galvanize on this in the future. After every war that Israel launches on the Palestinians, Israel goes into this kind of reversal mode of trying to, the propaganda and the Netflix and the Hollywood movies and the sitcoms and the Maxim covers of the girls of the IDF and all the nonsense every single time. This time around, they will not succeed using the typical Hasbara and propaganda to deny the world the knowledge of what has happened. But we can't go back after the genocide to the way we were doing things. And that's the question from the gentleman at the conference that spoke about how do we engage not just states, but the actual global movement, the public. I was giving a talk in some tiny little village in southern Italy just recently, when I was approached by a group of youth, young Italian kids. It was around the time of Easter. And they were asking me the strangest question. They were saying, we would like, to have our mothers, really, our mothers cook Palestinian food or bread for Easter. Do you have any recipes? I was like, I've never been asked that question before, but just to think about the degree of penetration of Palestinian consciousness that reached a small village somewhere in a mountainous region in Abruzzo, where a group of kids so keen on cooking Palestinian food at their homes. We cannot squander this historic moment. We need to talk to these kids. We need to talk to their families, to their teachers, to their communities. We need to engage everyone. We need to break away from this Jacobian approach to intellectualism. We need to speak relatable Gramscian language that would allow us to bring everybody together, so that when the genocide is over and when the Zionists start their counter campaign and defamations and the anti-Semitism